Hi, I'm Mark Lickman, and I'm the project lead managing CGRAN and the Wiki. And I have a quick update about CGRAN and some discussion about minor reorg I'm leading for documentation in general, GNU Radio documentation. I'm going to start out with CGRAN just because it's pretty short. So if some of you are not familiar with CGRAN, it stands for Comprehensive GNU Radio Archive Network. And it's essentially just kind of an index for out-of-tree modules. So any third-party GNU Radio module. They pretty much all take the form of an out-of-tree module, which provide new blocks for GNU Radio. And these are blocks that are not officially supported by the project. So like Ben was mentioning, many people have taken upon themselves to maintain their own modules that are used widely. And here's some example out-of-tree modules that you may have heard of, like GR and there's ones for GSM, Wi-Fi, OFDM. And CGRAN is just a website that, CGRAN.org is the website, and it's just a listing of these out-of-tree modules. And as far as what's new about CGRAN, it's been around for a while, but it's actually up to date now. So for a while, it was pretty much just a snapshot of however many years ago. But now it's up to date, and it includes the most recent commits of all these out-of-tree modules, and that's actually what it orders by default. And there's a search bar that I added in there, and a new logo that we have, since we didn't have a good vectorized version of the old logo. So it really hasn't changed a whole lot, but it's just kind of being more maintained now. Now, here's an example. If you click one of those out-of-tree modules, you'll just see the basic information, like the name and where to find it, and the copyright owner. But this information comes straight from these out-of-tree module manifest files. So in the root directory of the repo, a lot of them have a manifest file with all the meta information. And in terms of what out-of-tree modules show up on CGRAN, it's only ones that have PyBombs recipes. That's kind of just how CGRAN was originally formed. So PyBombs lets you install out-of-tree modules fairly quickly and easily. And if you go to the GR, et cetera, or the GR recipes repo, you can see all the different PyBombs recipes. So CGRAN doesn't actually hold any of the information on its own. It just parses through the list of recipes and the manifest files. And that's kind of an issue, but it's also how it was designed. And there's really no reason why an out-of-tree module couldn't have a PyBombs installer recipe. One actual issue with CGRAN is that it only works well for out-of-tree modules hosted on GitHub, which is a large majority of them. But the other ones have to be kind of manually parsed out just a little bit. And then another issue is that there's a lot of PyBombs recipes that are not actually out-of-tree modules, and there's no automatic way to know whether it's an out-of-tree module or just some library that another out-of-tree module needed. So I've had to make a blacklist for all the non-out-of-tree modules. But those are just some little limitations of CGRAN. In general, I'd recommend checking it out. It's the most organized listing of these GNU Radio extensions. So if you're new to GNU Radio and you're curious what kind of apps or flow graphs you can that have already been produced, CGRAN would be a good starting point to check out. And that's all I had about CGRAN. Once again, it's live at cgran.org. So as far as documentation, I'm leading a very kind of minor reorg to try to address some of the issues that have been here for years with GNU Radio's documentation. I'm definitely looking for help. As far as the current state of GNU Radio documentation, there's multiple locations. There's the Doxygen kind of C++ API, the main manual that people probably think of when they think of GNU Radio documentation based on Doxygen. There's the Sphinx Manual, which it's the Python manual, but it doesn't have a lot of information in it, and I'm not even sure how many people really use it. And then there's the Wiki, which is kind of everything else, a lot of tutorials, how-to guides, community type updates. and then Tom's blog and other random places, of course. So the Doxygen, a lot of you are familiar with this. It contains the usage manual is a big portion of it in terms of how people access the usage or the GNU Radio manual. But it also contains all the block-specific documentation. So if you're in GNU Radio Companion and you go to the documentation tab of a block, it'll show that information was pulled from doc strings, and that shows up in the Doxygen manual. There's also snippets of other information here and there. Like if you go to the top level of the different components, there's kind of descriptions of that component, but sometimes it's buried away. And then, of course, there's tons of auto-generated descriptions, just functions and classes that have no other doc strings. They just pretty much have a list of arguments. And it works, but there are some places that could be improved. As far as the Sphinx manual, it's pretty much all auto-generated Sphinx stuff, showing you the Python versions of every function and class and such. And there's a lot of room for improvement there. And I'm also curious if anyone uses it and how they use it. Now, as far as the wiki, it's definitely gained a lot of traction the last year or so. It contains probably the best installation guides, getting started guides, tutorials, links to other information out there on the internet. There's community info like the dev call notes, hardware info, and just various miscellaneous articles. And I'd encourage you to check out the GNU Radio Wiki. It's definitely alive, and you can register. And it might take a day for the registration to be accepted because we've had a lot of bots try to mess with it. So it's a manual approval process right now. I get an email, as well as some other people. So as far as what are the biggest issues with GNU Radio documentation, not including just blocks without documentation. That's probably the biggest one, right? Blocks that have arguments that are not documented at all. But that's the kind of thing that really takes block experts to just contribute. So besides that, I think one of the biggest issues is that information is spread out among many different locations, which is a problem because if you're new and you're trying to find something, you might not know where to look, and there's a lot of duplicate information. People new to GNU Radio, I've found, very often have issues just finding basic information. They may not know about the wiki, or they may see it and think it's kind of dead. They may see the Doxygen Manual and not know which topics to click on. And then another big issue is that contributions to the Doxygen content, I think, might be intimidating for some because we really don't see a lot of updates to it. It's stored in the main repo, and it requires a git commit to change it. Maybe that's too many steps just for quick little changes. And lastly, the Sphinx manual, the Python manual, it's pretty much all auto-generated, and I think if we identify what people use in that manual, there's probably a better way to organize that information than just a huge list of Python versions of functions. So here's some possible solutions that I'm going to throw out there. One solution, I think, is for the Doxygen manual to only contain documentation that's specific to a block or class or function, not general purpose type stuff. And then if it is kind of more, if it's not specific to a block or class or function, it could go in the wiki. But one problem is that the usage manual is it's been there forever, and it's a large part of the Doxygen manual. And people definitely use it offline and go to it for reference. But I think it would do better in the wiki just because people could add to it and modify more easily. It's just that brings a bunch of problems, like what if someone's using GNU Radio offline? And then another issue with the Doxygen manual is that there's a lot of information that's just buried into it, like the top levels of components. I don't know how many people see that, but there's a lot of good information that's not easily found. As far as the Python manual, I think I'd like to figure out how people really use it and if the information we want to get from it can be organized in a better way. And I know from my experience, I'm mainly interested, as someone who creates Python blocks sometimes, I want to know the Python versions of functions for functions you would call in a block. But the manual contains a lot of internal type functions, internal to the generated runtime and scheduler, that someone just writing a block wouldn't care about. So they could probably be separated and then maybe categorized in a more logical way instead of just a list. Although, I mean, it's partially, there's some categorization in the Sphinx Manual, but not a whole lot. And I think that's a kind of a quick fix once we identify how people really want to use the Python manual. And then lastly, an issue that we've always had is just the ease of contributions. The documentation just doesn't get updated very often. So we need good instructions for how to modify the Doxygen Manual, or more easily found instructions. I know the Wiki has a couple articles about how to do it. And then one idea I had was in the GRC's GitHub, or in the GRC tab for documentation, perhaps like a link to GitHub's built-in text editor. If you've ever used it, that actually lets you just kind of edit text, hit enter, and then it creates the commit for you and the pull request. That'd be a nice way, I think, to make it a little more easy for someone to improve documentation, like if they see a typo or just something that's wrong, like units. If they figure out it says seconds, the units of some argument was seconds, and it says seconds, and it should be milliseconds. That's an important thing to fix. And then another option, so there's a lot of people who are experts with certain blocks who maybe don't have the time to improve the documentation of that block. So perhaps a form they could fill out that does not require them to conform to any syntax. It's just they're an expert on this block and they want to add some descriptions about the arguments. The form would be probably just converted to an email sent to a group of leads, and then if anyone has time, they can enter that into the documentation manually. So that's not ideal, but I think it's the best way to get kind of expert input into our documentation. And then lastly, using the wiki for anything that's appropriate would be great, since it's so easy to change and so accessible. As far as the efforts to date, I've kind of just started on this minor reorg, and I'm definitely looking for help. But what I've done so far, I used an automatic tool that converts from the Doxygen format to the wiki format on all the usage manual pages. So they're actually in the wiki right now, but there's definitely touch-ups needed. But if we decide the usage manual should not live in the wiki, then I'll just remove them because I don't want to make it so there's even more duplicate content. But overall, it's not too difficult to convert from Doxygen to wiki. I've also organized some of the wiki content, but there's still plenty left. There's a lot of duplicate articles and just articles that need to be kind of merged and organized. A lot of them were copied and pasted from another source into the wiki, so they don't fit well. But it's still important information to have in there. And then to address the issue of if the usage manual lived in the wiki, how would people offline be able to use it? Because it's in the main repo. So I wrote a little script that can export certain pages so we can list all the usage manual pages. That exports them to just text files that look a lot like the kind of the old wiki, the doc files. And then what we could do is just periodically run that and include them in the main repo, so that if someone went to look for the usage manual where it's always been, that's what they would see. And it looks very similar to how you would see the usage manual if you opened it up in a text editor. But of course, it's not going to render in HTML like it currently does, locally at least. So that's just one little script that might help if we decide to have the usage manual be in the wiki, which is still up in the air because there's pros and cons to it. Now, input I definitely wanted to get here because it's just hard to get people talking about. I mean, obviously, people mention they complain about documentation all the time, but information that would be useful to me is, well, first off, like I've been saying, would it be a problem if the usage manual is on the wiki? What kind of problems would arise? And then also, I'm curious in what ways people use the Python API. So anyone who uses it heavily, definitely let me know how you use it and if you have any ideas about how it could be organized better. And then also, what would make people more likely to contribute any documentation-related changes? We just see so little of it, so I'm curious what we could do there. And I definitely want to get input, so just to wrap it up so we can move to questions and comments, check out CGRAN.org, post on Slack if there's any issues with it. It's it's a new web app that I put together, so there may be issues. And then reach out to me if you want to help with the mini reorg for documentation, or if you have any comments or questions and don't want to see our documentation get worse, right? So yeah, as far as input, anything at all related to what I said, including these questions, would be awesome. So, anyone?
All right, let's thank our speaker real quick.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Also, before we take questions, I just want to say, I wrote that LaTeX theme like 5 years ago. You're the first person I've seen use it.
Oh yeah, I went to look for a PowerPoint template, and this is all I found was a Beamer template. So I was like, okay, whatever.
All right.
Okay,
questions for Mark, anybody?
Yep.
Oh, hey, Ralph.
So for your second question, I think it's generally just useful for rapid prototyping, right? So you just bring up the Python sort of embedded block and you just type like maybe 20 lines of code.
Yes.
Because the C++ has a lot of boilerplate that's not always necessary depending on what you're doing. So just testing ideas is how I use the Python API.
So that's why you would use Python for a block.
Yeah, just the prototype. Eventually, like if you're doing anything serious, it eventually gets like translated into C++.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But it's just there for, okay, I need to try this idea. How does it work? Using SciPy or NumPy, stuff like that.
Yeah, so if you're writing a block in Python and you want to get the documentation you need, so the Python versions of, looking at whatever tags are in your input buffer, the usage manual actually has, that'd probably be the best place for that answer, but the names of functions that are not in the usage manual, you'd go to the Python manual. But then the question is like, well, I guess does anyone use it, and how do they use it? But yeah, Python blocks and embedded Python blocks, so you don't even have to make a new AdaptTree module, are really valuable, and I use them all the time for quick prototyping.
Other questions in the audience?
Yeah. No one?
I actually have a question for you. So one of the things that, as you're starting to dig into this, one of the things that we've really struggled with as a community, I think, over the decades, is knowing where to draw the line in terms of what we focus on with our documentation, right? So like, SDR is hard, right? I mean, you have to know, like, really, if you're going to really dig into the depths of it, I mean, you need to know software, you need to know Linux, you need to know DSP, you need to know radio hardware, you need to know analog comms. Like, there's just this FPGA development. Like, there's this huge array of stuff, right? And like occasionally, right, we still get emails to the list that's like, hey, I'm having trouble installing it. Somebody will post a command that's like, sudo apt-get whatever, and they're like, what's a command line? So I guess, and the next step up from that would be somebody saying, this isn't working for me, and somebody says, oh, okay, like, what are the radio parameters you're using? They're like, well, we don't know what gain is, right? We're just interested in, and that kind of ties back into what I talked a little bit is, we've seen the community expand beyond radio people and DSP people into people who know nothing about that stuff. They just want to use it because they're using it for some esoteric application. So I guess, do you have any thoughts on like, what do we include? What do we not include? Where do we spend our time?
Yeah, I mean, when I was organizing a lot of the Wiki content, there's a lot of DSP tutorials in the Wiki, which is kind of interesting. Someone took the time to write it. I think we definitely need to reference other material for DSP tutorials, like that open source textbook. I forget what it's called, the DSP book. But I think it would be good to have to draw the line and say, this is what we're going to include in our documentation and in the wiki, and then this is what we're just going to have to reference other material for. And I think a good line would be, if it's really just a basic DSP tutorial, has nothing to do with GNU Radio, we probably shouldn't actually be maintaining that documentation. If it's already in the wiki, we're not going to delete it, but I think that'd be a good line to draw. And this is also related to where should we put that documentation, right? So that's not all over the place. But I'd definitely like to get input on where that line should be drawn.
Okay. Other questions from the audience? No? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Mark.